My name is Milka Blair. I'm 39 years old now, and for most of my adult life, I've been what people politely call reliable. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays without reminders. The kind who keeps the family calendar organized. Who listens more than she talks. Who rarely raises her voice even when she probably should. If you met me casually, you might think you understood me within the first 5 minutes. Most people do. They see a quiet woman with steady habits. Someone practical, predictable, maybe even a little boring. I've spent years watching people form that impression of me, and I've never rushed to correct it. Not because it's completely true, but because I've learned something over time. The way people underestimate you often tells you more about them than it does about you. 10 years ago, I married my husband. At the time, everything about our relationship looked normal from the outside. We had a beautiful wedding, a modest house, and the kind of polite conversations couples have when their lives are just beginning to blend together. But not long after the wedding, something about him began to change. Not dramatically, not in the way people usually describe when they talk about troubled marriages. There were no screaming arguments, no slammed doors, no obvious betrayals. Instead, it was something quieter. Subtle shifts in the way he spoke to me. Small hesitations where warmth used to be. Moments where I felt, for reasons I couldn't quite explain, as though I had somehow stepped slightly out of focus in my own marriage. For years, I told myself it was nothing. People change. Life gets complicated. Marriage settles into routines. At least, that's what I believed. But when I look back now, 10 years later, I can see that the signs were there from the very beginning. Small details that didn't make sense at the time. Reactions that felt oddly rehearsed. Silences that carried more meaning than words. And it took an entire decade and one very honest conversation before the real reason behind his behavior finally made sense. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone or proving that I was right all along. If anything, it's about how long it can take to understand the people closest to us, and how sometimes the truth is much quieter and more complicated than we expect. Because the strange thing is, once I finally understood why my husband had been acting the way he did, the past 10 years of our marriage suddenly looked completely different. Almost as if I had been watching the wrong story the entire time. And I sometimes wonder, have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized that the meaning of certain moments only became clear years later? For most of my life, people have described me using the same handful of words. Reliable. Kind. Easy to be around. They meant it as a compliment, and I always accepted it as one. But over the years, I began to notice something hidden inside those descriptions. Reliable people are often the ones others stop noticing. I don't say that with bitterness. It's just a quiet observation. Before my marriage, I had already grown comfortable occupying that kind of space. I worked at a small nonprofit arts center in Portland, coordinating events, scheduling volunteers, and making sure every small moving part lined up the way it should. My job wasn't glamorous, but things fell apart quickly when someone wasn't paying attention. And attention has always been something I'm good at. I notice when a room goes silent half a second too early after someone finishes speaking. I notice when someone laughs a little louder than the joke deserves. And I notice the moment a person's tone shifts, even when their words stay exactly the same. That skill made me good at my job. It also made me very good at understanding people. When I met my husband, Daniel, I thought I understood him too. He was charming in a quiet, thoughtful way. Not the loud kind of confidence that fills a room, but the kind that makes people lean closer when he speaks. He worked as a civil engineer, and the first thing that impressed me about him was how seriously he took responsibility. The way he talked about bridges and infrastructure made it sound less like construction and more like protecting something important. I admired that. Our relationship moved at a pace that felt natural. Two people with stable jobs, shared routines, and similar ideas about what a peaceful life looked like. When we got married, our friends often joked that we were the most predictable couple they knew. They didn't mean it negatively. Predictable meant stable, and stable meant safe. At our wedding reception, I remember standing near the edge of the room watching our families talk. Daniel's parents were laughing with my sister. My coworkers had already found the dessert table. Music floated softly across the room. Everything looked exactly the way weddings are supposed to look. I remember thinking very clearly, this is what a good life looks like. But even that night, though I didn't understand it yet, there was something else. A small moment. One of those moments so quiet that if you blinked, you might miss it. Daniel had his arm loosely around my shoulders while we spoke to one of his colleagues. The man congratulated us and said something about how lucky Daniel was. And Daniel laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, just lightly. Then he said something I didn't fully register at the time. "Milka's the organized one," he told him. "She keeps everything running smoothly." The man nodded approvingly, like that explained everything. And I smiled, because it sounded like praise. But as the conversation drifted away, I remember noticing something subtle in Daniel's voice. Something that didn't quite feel like admiration, more like classification. As though, in that moment, he had quietly placed me into a role, one that everyone around us seemed perfectly comfortable with. The dependable one. The calm one. The one who made things work quietly in the background. And at the time, I didn't question it, because when people treat you a certain way for long enough, you start to believe that maybe that's simply the part you're meant to play. But looking back now, I realized something important about that night. That role wasn't something I chose. It was something that had already been chosen for me. And I didn't even realize it yet. If you asked most people when the first real problem appeared in their marriage, they would probably describe something obvious. A fight, a betrayal, a moment when voices got louder than usual. But the first moment I remember wasn't dramatic at all. It was so small that, if I had mentioned it to someone else, they probably would have smiled politely and told me I was overthinking it. The first year of our marriage was quiet in the way new marriages often are. We were learning each other's routines, learning which cabinet the other person instinctively opened first, learning how silence felt when it belonged to both of us instead of just one person. Daniel worked long hours during the week, but weekends were usually calm. Grocery shopping together, fixing small things around the house, and sometimes meeting friends for dinner. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after our wedding, we hosted a small gathering at our house. Nothing elaborate, just a few of Daniel's coworkers and 2 of my friends from the arts center. I remember standing in the kitchen, slicing lemons for iced tea while everyone talked in the living room. From where I stood, I could hear most of the conversation drifting through the doorway. At some point, Daniel's colleague, his name was Marcus, I think, asked how Daniel had managed to balance work with wedding planning the previous year. Daniel laughed. "Oh, I didn't," he said. "Milka handled all of that." There was a short pause, the kind that happens when someone is about to add something playful. "She's incredibly organized," he continued. "Honestly, if I had been in charge, we probably wouldn't even have sent invitations." Everyone laughed, including me, because technically it wasn't untrue. I had organized most of the planning. The venues, the guest lists, the seating charts. I had always been good at that kind of thing. But then Marcus asked another question. "So you just stayed out of it?" Daniel answered easily. "More or less. Milka likes that kind of thing." Something in that sentence settled strangely in my chest. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't. But the way he said it made it sound as if the entire wedding had been my project, rather than something we had created together. As if my role had simply been to manage the logistics while he stood slightly outside the process. The conversation moved on quickly. Someone asked about a bridge project Daniel had been working on. The focus shifted back to him, to the impressive scale of the work he was doing, and I carried the tray of iced tea into the living room. Everyone thanked me. Someone complimented the lemon slices. The moment passed the way small moments usually do. But later that night, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were stacked in the sink, I found myself replaying that sentence in my head. Milka likes that kind of thing. It sounded harmless, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something subtle about the way he had framed it. He hadn't said, "We planned it together." He hadn't said, "She did an amazing job." He had simply described the situation as if it had always been obvious. Milka organizes things. Daniel focuses on bigger responsibilities. It was the first time I felt the faintest shift in how our partnership was being described, not just by other people, but by him. And what struck me most was how easily everyone had accepted that version of the story. No one questioned it. No one noticed the difference, except me. And at the time, I told myself something very simple. It was just a sentence. Just a casual comment at a small gathering. But sometimes the smallest cuts are the ones you remember longest. Not because they hurt, but because of how quietly they happen. After that afternoon, nothing changed in any dramatic way. Daniel didn't suddenly become cold. Our marriage didn't transform overnight into something tense or unhappy. If anything, most days continued exactly the way they always had. We woke up early. He left for work before I did. In the evenings, we ate dinner together, talked about our days, and watched the occasional documentary before going to bed. From the outside, it looked like a stable life, and in many ways, it was. But once you notice something small, it becomes harder to unnotice the pattern that surrounds it. Over the next year or two, there were other moments. Little ones. The kind that don't interrupt a conversation, but quietly change its direction. At dinner with friends, someone once asked Daniel how we handled finances. He smiled and said, "Milka keeps track of the bills. She's better with that kind of detail." Another time, during a family gathering, his mother complimented the way our house always looked so orderly. Daniel chuckled and said, "That's all, Milka. If it were up to me, I'd probably forget where half my things are." Again, everyone laughed. And again, technically, nothing he said was incorrect. I did manage the bills. I did keep the house organized. But the pattern was subtle. Whenever the conversation turned to structure, stability, or daily responsibilities, I became the person who handled the small things. And Daniel, almost without realizing it, became the person associated with the important ones. Work, decisions, big picture thinking. It wasn't something he announced intentionally. It just slowly became the story. At first, I rationalized it, partly because I understood how conversations work. People simplify roles when they explain relationships. It makes everything easier to describe. And partly because I didn't want to seem sensitive over something that sounded so minor. If I had told one of my friends, they probably would have said, "Milka, that just means he trusts you." And maybe that was true. But there was another layer beneath it that was harder to explain. Over time, I noticed that Daniel started asking my opinion less often when decisions involved something larger than everyday logistics. Not in a dismissive way, more like an assumption. If we talked about buying new furniture, he would ask what I preferred. But if the conversation turned to something like long-term financial planning, or whether we should consider moving closer to his office someday, the tone shifted slightly. He would explain his thinking rather than invite mine. Almost as if he believed he was sparing me from something complicated. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Because Daniel wasn't arrogant. He wasn't loud or controlling. He was still thoughtful in 100 small ways, bringing home my favorite tea when he stopped at the store, fixing the porch light without being asked. Those gestures made it easy to overlook the other pattern. And the truth is, I played a part in allowing it. When someone consistently assigns you a certain role, there are two ways to respond. You can challenge it, or you can quietly step into it. I stepped into it. Not out of fear, but out of practicality. Correcting small misunderstandings in front of other people felt unnecessary. And most of the time, it seemed easier to simply let the conversation move on. So when Daniel described me as the organized one, the reliable one, the person who handled the details, I smiled, I nodded, and eventually, I stopped noticing when it happened. That's the strange thing about subtle disrespect. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it slowly becomes part of the background noise of your life. Until one day you realize that everyone around you has accepted a version of the story that you never consciously agreed to. And by the time you notice it clearly, it already feels normal. It took several years before I understood that something more permanent had quietly settled into our marriage. Not a conflict, a structure. And like most structures, it wasn't something anyone announced out loud. It simply became the way things worked. By our 4th year of marriage, Daniel had been promoted at his firm. His projects were bigger, his hours longer, and the conversations around his work often carried a certain weight when we were with other people. At dinner parties, someone would inevitably ask him about the latest bridge or highway expansion his company was designing. Daniel would explain patiently, drawing small diagrams on napkins, describing how different systems fit together. People leaned forward when he talked about it. You could see admiration in their faces. Engineering had that effect. It sounded important, and it was. Meanwhile, my work at the art center remained what it had always been: steady, useful, and quietly behind the scenes. When people asked what I did, I usually summarized it in one sentence: I coordinate programs and events. They nodded politely. Then the conversation drifted back toward Daniel. Again, none of this was unusual. Couples often have careers that draw different levels of attention. I didn't resent that. But over time, I began to notice something interesting about the way our roles were described when both of us were present. Daniel built things. I kept things running. It wasn't insulting. In fact, people often praise the combination. You two balance each other perfectly, someone once said at a neighborhood gathering. I remember smiling when I heard it. But later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time thinking about that sentence. Balance suggests equality. Yet something about the way our lives had arranged themselves didn't feel quite like balance. It felt more like support. I supported the stability of our home. I handled schedules, bills, repairs, family birthdays, and social plans. I remembered the details that kept life from becoming chaotic. And Daniel moved through the larger arcs of our future: career decisions, financial planning, the direction our lives might take 5 or 10 years ahead. Again, this wasn't something we had consciously negotiated. It was simply the role I had slowly been assigned. The dependable foundation, the person who made sure everything else worked. Most of the time, I accepted that role without resistance. After all, I was good at it. Order and structure came naturally to me. But occasionally, a small question would appear in the back of my mind. Not angry, just curious. When had we decided that this was the shape of our partnership? Because if I looked back honestly, I couldn't remember a single conversation where we had chosen it together. It had simply happened. And perhaps the most interesting part was how comfortable everyone else seemed with that arrangement. Friends described me as Daniel's calm center. His mother once told me, with genuine affection, "You make his life so much easier." Even Daniel himself would occasionally say something similar. "You keep everything together," he told me one evening while we were washing dishes. At the time, I took it as appreciation. But appreciation and expectation can sound surprisingly similar when repeated often enough. By then, the role had settled around me like a familiar coat. Useful, comfortable, a little heavier than I realized. and I might have continued wearing it indefinitely. If one very quiet moment, a few years later, hadn't shifted the way I saw everything, not with a fight, not with an accusation, just a small realization that changed something inside me. The kind of realization that doesn't happen all at once. But once it begins, it's impossible to reverse. The moment that changed everything didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen in front of other people. And it certainly didn't arrive with the kind of drama that makes a person suddenly rethink their entire life. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. Daniel had come home later than usual that day. I remember because dinner had already cooled slightly on the stove by the time I heard his car in the driveway. When he walked in, he looked tired in the way people do after spending too many hours solving complicated problems. We ate together in the kitchen. He talked about a project deadline that had been moved forward unexpectedly. A contractor had miscalculated something. Now the entire team had to adjust their timeline. I listened, the way I always did. Occasionally I asked a question, partly out of curiosity and partly because I genuinely liked hearing about the way his mind worked. Daniel had a methodical way of explaining things, like someone carefully laying down stepping stones across a river. At one point, he paused mid-sentence and frowned slightly. "I think we're going to need to reconsider the budget allocation for the second phase," he said. Without thinking too much about it, I offered a thought. "Well, if the timeline changed that suddenly, maybe the real issue isn't the budget," I said. "Maybe the sequence of decisions needs to shift first." Daniel looked up. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled. Lightly. The way someone does when they're humoring a comment that doesn't quite belong to the conversation. "That's not really how these projects work," he said gently. "But I appreciate the idea." And then he continued explaining the situation as if the interruption had never happened. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. No tension, no raised voices, nothing that anyone else would have considered significant. But something about it stayed with me. Not the fact that he disagreed with me. People disagree all the time. It was the tone. The same tone someone might use when a child suggests a creative but impractical solution. Kind, patient, and quietly dismissive. Later that night, after Daniel had gone upstairs to answer a few late emails, I remained at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house was completely silent. For the first time in years, I replayed not just that moment, but many other small moments that had happened before it. The conversations where my thoughts had been acknowledged politely, but not explored. The way decisions about our future were often explained to me rather than discussed with me. The subtle pattern of assumptions that had slowly shaped our dynamic. And suddenly, a question appeared in my mind that I had never allowed myself to ask directly before. Does Daniel actually think I understand less than he does? Not because he was arrogant, not because he intended to hurt me, but because somewhere along the way, the role I had been placed in, the organized one, the dependable one, the quiet support, had quietly expanded into something else, something smaller. I sat there for a long time thinking about that. And the surprising part wasn't anger, it was clarity. Because once the question appeared, I realized something else. For years, I had been allowing people, including my own husband, to underestimate parts of me that I had never fully shown. Not out of fear, simply out of habit. That night, something shifted. Not outwardly. Nothing changed in our routines the next morning. Daniel still left early for work. I still went to the arts center. But internally, something had become very clear. If someone believes they understand the limits of you, you can either spend your energy arguing with that belief, or you can quietly allow time to reveal something different. And for the first time in my life, I began to consider the second option. After that evening at the kitchen table, nothing changed in any visible way. That was the first decision I made. Not to confront Daniel, not to correct him, not to suddenly start proving that I understood things he assumed I didn't. Instead, I did something much quieter. I started paying closer attention. The strange thing about clarity is that once you see a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore how often it appears. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how Daniel spoke during conversations that involved planning or strategy. His language was careful and logical, the same tone he used when explaining technical problems at work. But when he spoke with me about those topics, there was often a subtle simplification. He would summarize decisions rather than explore them. Sometimes he paused halfway through an explanation, as if deciding whether the rest was worth describing. Not maliciously, just automatically. And for the first time, instead of correcting him or inserting my opinion, I simply listened. Silence, I discovered, can be a very revealing tool. When you stop filling the space with explanations or reactions, people often show you exactly what they assume about you. One evening, Daniel mentioned that his company might be bidding on a major infrastructure project in another state. It could mean relocating eventually, he said while scrolling through something on his phone. In the past, I would have immediately asked questions about timelines, about where the project was located, about whether the company had already begun negotiations. That night, I just nodded. "Oh," I said. "That's interesting." Daniel glanced up briefly, perhaps expecting more curiosity. When none came, he returned to his phone and continued describing the situation on his own. He spoke for several minutes. By the end of it, I realized something important. He had already formed a complete opinion about the opportunity before mentioning it to me. Not because he was intentionally excluding me, but because somewhere in his mind, he had grown accustomed to viewing those decisions as part of his domain, and I had quietly allowed that pattern to develop. From that point forward, I stopped correcting the assumptions people made about me. If someone described me as the organized one, I smiled. If Daniel explained something in a simplified way, I listened. Outwardly, nothing changed, but internally, something very different had begun. I started reading more in the evenings, books about economics, long-term financial planning, and urban development. Topics that overlapped surprisingly often with the things Daniel talked about from work. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I realized I had been allowing my curiosity to stay hidden behind the role others expected me to play. At the Arts Center, I began paying attention to the way our nonprofit handled funding and budgeting. The executive director occasionally asked me to help review grant allocations because of how carefully I tracked program expenses. Those conversations were different. There, my observations weren't dismissed politely. They were used. Over time, I began to notice a quiet irony. The more silent I became in certain conversations at home, the more attentive I became to everything else around me. Patterns, decisions, motivations. Daniel assumed my silence meant agreement, or perhaps disinterest. But in reality, it had become something else entirely. Observation. Because when people believe you're not paying attention, they often reveal far more than they realize. And what I began to notice over the next year was something Daniel never suspected I was seeing. Once you start observing people carefully, a strange thing happens. You begin to realize how much of the world runs on assumptions. Not malicious ones, not even particularly unfair ones. Just quiet expectations that everyone follows because no one has paused long enough to question them. For years, Daniel had assumed I was content managing the smaller details of our lives. And because I rarely contradicted that assumption, it slowly hardened into something that felt permanent. But while those assumptions remained intact on the surface, something else had begun quietly shifting underneath. My attention. At first, the changes were small. I started keeping a notebook again, the same worn leather one I had carried years earlier when I first began working at the Arts Center. Most people use notebooks to record appointments or tasks. Mine was different. I wrote down observations. Nothing dramatic, just small details about how people made decisions, what they prioritized, and how those priorities influenced everything else around them. At the Arts Center, I paid closer attention to the way funding moved through our programs. I noticed which grants had strict reporting requirements and which ones allowed more flexibility. I learned how the director negotiated budgets with sponsors. None of that was technically part of my job, but no one objected. In fact, my coworkers appreciated it. "You catch things the rest of us miss," the director told me once during a planning meeting. It wasn't praise that surprised me. It was the fact that he trusted my judgment without hesitation. At home, Daniel never asked what I had been reading lately. Not out of disinterest, just habit. Our conversations had settled into familiar rhythms over the years. He talked about engineering projects. I talked about upcoming events at the Arts Center. But gradually, the information he shared started connecting with the things I had been learning on my own. When he mentioned changes in infrastructure funding, I already understood the broader economic context behind it. When he talked about city planning discussions, I had often read about similar debates in other states. I didn't interrupt. I simply listened. And every once in a while, I asked a carefully placed question. Not to challenge him, just to see how he responded. Sometimes he paused longer than usual before answering. Sometimes he looked slightly surprised by the angle of the question. But the moment always passed quickly. Because Daniel still believed the basic structure of our roles hadn't changed. And in many ways, it hadn't. From the outside, our lives looked exactly the same. I still handled the house. I still coordinated our schedules. I still remember birthdays and social plans. But the difference now was internal. For the first time, I was no longer accepting the limits that others assumed existed. I was quietly expanding them. The most interesting part was how invisible that process was. No dramatic declarations, no arguments, just quiet preparation, reading, listening, understanding systems that most people only notice when something goes wrong. One evening, about 2 years after that night in the kitchen, Daniel came home visibly frustrated about a problem at work. A contractor had mismanaged part of a design adjustment, and the delay was going to cost the company a significant amount of money. He spent 20 minutes explaining the situation while pacing slowly around the living room. When he finished, he sighed and said, almost to himself, the whole situation could have been avoided if someone had spotted the problem earlier. I didn't respond immediately. Then I asked one simple question. Was the review process centralized or split between departments? Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Split, he said. I nodded slowly. That makes it harder for anyone to catch the pattern early. For a brief second, he studied my expression, not suspiciously, just thoughtfully. Then he shrugged lightly and changed the subject. The conversation moved on. But after he went upstairs that night, I sat in the quiet living room and realized something important. For the first time in years, Daniel had paused. Not because he was dismissing my perspective, but because he hadn't expected it. And that moment, small as it was, told me something very clear. There were parts of me that Daniel had never fully seen. Not because he refused to look, but because I had never shown them. And what he didn't know yet. Was that one of those unseen details that would soon change the way I understood our entire marriage? The moment of clarity didn't arrive like a discovery. It arrived like a connection. A quiet realization formed when several small details finally lined up in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. It happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Daniel was working upstairs in the small home office we had set up in our second bedroom. He occasionally used weekends to review project documents when deadlines were approaching. I was downstairs on the couch with my notebook and a cup of tea, reading through an article about municipal infrastructure budgets. It was something I had started following casually over the past couple of years. Halfway through the article, I noticed a familiar name. Daniel's company. The article wasn't about him personally, of course. It discussed a large regional development project that several firms were competing to manage. The piece focused mostly on how those contracts were awarded and how public funding shaped the process. Normally, I would have skimmed past it, but one sentence caught my attention. It mentioned that Daniel's firm had recently secured preliminary design approval for part of the project, but the funding structure was unusually complex, involving multiple municipal review boards. I reread that paragraph slowly. Then I remembered something Daniel had said a few weeks earlier while describing one of his projects. At the time, it had sounded like a minor frustration about paperwork delays. Now it sounded different. I set the article aside and opened my notebook. Over the past 2 years, I had occasionally written down things Daniel mentioned about his work. Not secrets, just casual comments that seemed interesting at the time. Project timelines, budget approvals, department reviews. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something unexpected. Several of the delays he had mentioned followed a similar pattern. A design issue would appear, then a funding adjustment, then another review cycle. Each step slowed the project down in ways that seemed oddly predictable. At first, I wondered if I was overanalyzing the situation, but the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. Daniel wasn't frustrated because he didn't understand the system. He was frustrated because he understood it very well. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. That night at the kitchen table years earlier. The moment when he dismissed my suggestion about shifting the sequence of decisions. At the time, I had assumed he believed I simply didn't understand how projects like his worked. But now another possibility appeared. What if he hadn't dismissed the idea because it was wrong? What if he dismissed it because it was too close to the actual problem? I sat there for a long time thinking about that. Not with suspicion, just with quiet curiosity. Because if that interpretation was true, it meant something important about Daniel's behavior over the years might have had a completely different explanation than the one I had assumed. Maybe he hadn't been underestimating me. Maybe he had been protecting something, not from me, but from the possibility that I might understand it. The realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me strangely calm, because suddenly, the past 10 years of subtle conversations, careful explanations, and occasional dismissals began to look slightly different. Less like arrogance, more like control. Not the controlling kind that limits someone else. The kind that carefully manages information. And once that thought appeared, another one followed quietly behind it. If Daniel had been managing what I understood about certain things, then he had also been assuming something very specific about me, that I would never notice the pattern. I closed my notebook and looked around the quiet living room. The house felt exactly the same as it always had. Nothing had changed. And yet something had become very clear. For the first time, I understood that the dynamic in our marriage might not have been built entirely on misunderstanding. Part of it might have been intentional. Not cruel, not manipulative in the way people often imagine, but deliberate, a careful shaping of roles. And now I faced a question that mattered far more than the discovery itself. Because once you see something clearly, you have to decide what to do with that knowledge. For a few days after that rainy Sunday afternoon, I didn't do anything differently. At least, not in a way Daniel could see. Life continued with the same quiet routines we had followed for years. Breakfast in the morning, work during the day. Evenings spent in the same comfortable spaces we had slowly built together. But internally, something had shifted. The realization I had that afternoon didn't feel dramatic. It didn't come with anger or a sense of betrayal. Instead, it created a kind of stillness. Because when you finally understand that a pattern might be intentional rather than accidental, the next step becomes very simple. You have to choose how you respond. For the first time in our marriage, I allowed myself to consider several possibilities without rushing toward any of them. One option was confrontation. I could sit Daniel down and explain what I had noticed. I could ask direct questions about the projects he described, the funding systems he worked within, and the reasons he sometimes simplified his explanations when speaking to me. That approach would have been honest, but it also would have forced the conversation into a defensive shape immediately. Once people feel accused, even gently, they instinctively begin protecting themselves. Another option was distance. I could slowly withdraw from the parts of our life that revolved around his world. Stop engaging with conversations about work, stop asking questions entirely, and allow our lives to drift into two separate orbits. Some marriages quietly become that way over time. But when I imagined that future, something about it felt incomplete. Not sad, just unresolved. And then there was a third possibility: observation. Instead of confronting the pattern directly, I could simply continue paying attention. Not to prove a point, not to catch Daniel doing something wrong, just to understand the truth more clearly. Because one thing I had learned over the past few years was that clarity often arrives gradually, not all at once. The danger of reacting too quickly is that you sometimes act before the full picture appears. So I made a decision that surprised even me. I chose patience, not passive patience, the kind where you wait for someone else to change. Intentional patience. I would keep listening. I would keep noticing the details that others overlooked, and I would quietly continue expanding my understanding of the systems Daniel moved through every day. If my interpretation was wrong, time would reveal that. And if it was right, then, eventually, there would be a moment when the truth surfaced naturally. Not forced, not dramatic, just undeniable. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly that moment would arrive. About 3 weeks after that Sunday afternoon, Daniel came home one evening looking unusually thoughtful. Not frustrated the way he sometimes was after a difficult day. More preoccupied. During dinner, he mentioned that his firm had entered the final stage of negotiations for the regional project I had read about. "It's a complicated contract," he said, stirring his tea slowly. "There are a lot of moving parts behind the scenes." I nodded calmly. "I can imagine." Daniel studied me for a brief second, as if deciding whether to elaborate. Then he continued. "There are things about these projects that most people don't really understand." He said it casually, almost absent-mindedly. But in that moment, I felt something settle quietly into place, because I realized something important. Daniel wasn't hiding information out of arrogance. He believed something very specific. He believed I didn't need to understand it. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Do not confront him. Do not challenge him. Just move forward in silence. Because sometimes the clearest way to change a story isn't by arguing with it. It's by allowing the truth to appear on its own. And soon enough, it would. Once I made the decision to stay patient, something interesting happened. My attention sharpened even further. It wasn't that I was trying to uncover something dramatic. I wasn't searching for secrets or waiting for Daniel to slip and reveal something he shouldn't. Instead, I simply began moving through my life with a different kind of awareness. Quietly, intentionally. At the Arts Center, my role started expanding in ways that had nothing to do with Daniel. The director asked if I would help with a long-term funding strategy for several programs that relied on unstable grants. Normally, that kind of work would have gone to someone with a financial background, but he trusted the way I noticed patterns. So, for the first time, I began working closely with spreadsheets that mapped multi-year funding projections. I learned how organizations plan 5 years ahead rather than one season at a time. At first, it felt like learning a new language. But the longer I worked with those numbers, the more familiar they became. Patterns started appearing. Dependencies, hidden assumptions. And the surprising thing was how similar those patterns looked to the ones Daniel sometimes described in his infrastructure projects. Large systems always behave the same way. Change one element, and three other things quietly shift somewhere else. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel continued sharing pieces of information about the project his company was negotiating. Not details, just general frustrations about how complicated the approval process had become. One evening, he mentioned that several departments in the city council were reviewing the funding structure separately. "Everyone wants oversight," he said with a tired smile. "But too many layers slow everything down." I listened carefully. Then I asked one small question. "Do the departments share their review timelines with each other?" Daniel paused. "Not always," he said. "Why?" I shrugged lightly. "Just curious." He nodded and continued talking, but I noticed something subtle in his expression. A flicker of thought. Not suspicion. Recognition. As if the question had brushed against something he hadn't expected me to consider. But the moment passed quickly. And that was exactly the point. Because I wasn't trying to prove anything. Over the next several weeks, I continued doing what I had already begun doing. Learning, observing, understanding systems that most people only glance at briefly before moving on. And slowly, something important began to happen. The more I understood about how complex projects actually functioned, the funding structures, the review systems, the coordination between departments, the more I realized something surprising about Daniel. He wasn't simplifying his explanations because he believed I was incapable of understanding them. He was simplifying them because he believed they weren't relevant to me. In his mind, my world existed in a completely different category. Home, organization, stability. While his world existed somewhere larger and more complicated. Neither one threatened the other. They simply didn't overlap. And that assumption had quietly shaped the entire structure of our marriage for 10 years. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the boundary between those worlds had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gradually. Because the more I learned about systems and long-term planning, the more I began to see connections between our lives that Daniel had never imagined I might notice. Connections that would soon become impossible to ignore. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't require an argument. Just a single conversation, one that Daniel had never expected we would have. The conversation that started everything happened on an ordinary Wednesday night. Nothing about the evening felt unusual at first. Daniel came home a little later than usual, carrying the quiet fatigue that often followed long meetings. I had already finished dinner, but I waited while he reheated his plate and sat across from him at the kitchen table. For a few minutes, we talked about small things. An upcoming exhibit at the Arts Center, a neighbor who had finally finished repairing his fence. Then Daniel mentioned the project again. His company had officially secured the contract. "It's going to dominate the next few years," he said, stirring his tea slowly. "The planning stage alone is complicated." I nodded. "That makes sense." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel added something almost casually. "Most people have no idea how many moving pieces are behind something like that." Normally, that's where the conversation would have ended. He would say something general about the complexity of large infrastructure projects, and I would listen politely before the topic drifted somewhere else. But this time, I asked something different. "Is the funding tied to phased approvals?" I said calmly. Daniel stopped stirring his tea. He looked up at me. "What do you mean?" he asked. His tone wasn't defensive, just curious. I kept my voice relaxed. "Well, if multiple departments are reviewing the budget separately, it would make sense for the contract to release funding in stages," I said. "Otherwise, one delay could stall the entire timeline." Daniel didn't respond immediately. For the first time in a long while, He looked at me with a kind of focused attention that hadn't been part of our usual conversations. "That's actually part of it," he said slowly. I nodded once. "Then the bigger issue probably isn't the reviews themselves," I added. "It's how those timelines overlap." The silence that followed felt different from any we had shared before. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine curiosity. I shrugged lightly. "I've been reading about municipal funding structures lately," I said. "Some of the same patterns show up in nonprofit grant systems." He studied my face for a moment, not suspiciously. More like someone looking at a familiar room and realizing there was a door they had somehow never noticed before. Then something subtle shifted in his expression. Not discomfort. Recognition. For the next few minutes, Daniel asked a few more questions. Not challenging ones, just small clarifications about the articles I had read and the budgeting work I had been helping with at the Arts Center. The conversation stayed calm, but beneath the calmness, something important was happening. Daniel was adjusting his understanding of me. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way someone recalibrates their expectations when new information appears. Eventually, he stood up to take his plate to the sink. "Interesting," he said quietly. That was all. But after he went upstairs later that night, I sat alone in the kitchen and realized something very clear. For 10 years, Daniel had been operating under a quiet assumption about the limits of my world, and that assumption had just shifted. Not because I challenged him, not because I proved him wrong, simply because he had finally seen something he didn't expect to see. And the interesting thing about shifting assumptions is that once they move even a little, they rarely stay where they were. After that Wednesday night, Daniel didn't bring it up again immediately. At least not directly. But something in our conversations had changed. It wasn't dramatic. If someone had been watching us from the outside, they might not have noticed anything different at all. We still followed the same routines. We still spoke with the same calm familiarity that had defined our marriage for years. But Daniel began asking slightly different questions. Small ones. One evening, while we were clearing the table, he asked casually, "What kind of articles were you reading about those funding systems?" Another night, he mentioned one of the review delays on his project again, and this time, he paused halfway through explaining it. Then he said, "Actually, that part might interest you." It was a subtle shift. For the first time in a decade, he was inviting me into conversations that previously would have ended with a simplified explanation. And the strange part was how natural it felt. I answered calmly when he asked questions. I mentioned the work I had been doing at the Arts Center with long-term program funding. Occasionally, I connected those ideas to the patterns he described from his projects. No debates, no corrections, just conversation. But beneath that calm surface, something else was happening inside Daniel. At first, it appeared as curiosity. Then gradually, reflection. One Sunday morning, about 2 months after that first unexpected conversation, we were sitting on the porch drinking coffee when Daniel said something that surprised me. "I think I might have underestimated some things," he said. He didn't elaborate immediately. He just stared out toward the quiet street for a few seconds before continuing. "I always assumed your work stayed mostly within the Arts Center," he said slowly. "I didn't realize you were looking at the bigger systems behind it." I smiled gently. "Most people don't notice those parts," I said. Daniel nodded once, and then he said something even quieter. "I guess I didn't think you were interested in them." There was no accusation in his voice, just honesty. For a moment, I considered explaining everything. The articles I had read, the patterns I had noticed over the years, the way our conversations had slowly shaped my understanding of his world. But then I realized something important. That explanation wouldn't actually help him. Because the real realization Daniel was having wasn't about the information itself. It was about time. 10 years of quiet assumptions. 10 years of conversations where certain questions were never asked. 10 years where a version of me had existed in his mind that was smaller than the real one. None of that had happened maliciously. But that didn't mean it could be undone instantly either. Understanding someone more deeply doesn't rewrite the past. It simply changes the way you see it. Daniel seemed to understand that. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, still looking out at the street. "I wish I had realized it earlier," he said softly. His tone carried something new. Not guilt exactly, more like regret for a missed opportunity. I didn't respond right away. Because the truth was, I had been thinking about the same thing. Not angrily, just thoughtfully. Sometimes relationships don't break because of one dramatic moment. Sometimes they slowly settle into shapes that neither person fully questions until years later. And by the time someone finally notices, the structure has already been standing for a very long time. Changing it isn't impossible, but it's no longer simple either. The conversation that finally addressed everything happened a few weeks later. Not during an argument, not even during a particularly emotional moment. It happened on an evening when the house was unusually quiet. Daniel had finished reviewing some documents in the office, and I was sitting in the living room reading. He came downstairs, paused for a moment near the doorway, and then sat across from me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something very simple. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I closed my book and nodded. "Of course." Daniel rested his hands together, looking thoughtful. "Have I been talking to you differently all these years?" He asked. It wasn't a defensive question. It sounded more like someone trying to confirm a suspicion they had slowly been forming. I considered the best way to answer, because the truth, if delivered too bluntly, can sometimes feel like an accusation even when it isn't meant that way. So I answered carefully. "Not intentionally," I said. Daniel's eyebrows moved slightly. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in the chair, choosing my words slowly. "I think you assumed certain things about what interested me, or what I understood," I said. "And once that assumption settled in, it shaped how you explained things." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "That sounds accurate." There was no resistance in his voice, just acceptance. After a short pause, he asked the next question. "Why didn't you say anything?" It was a fair question, and the answer was simpler than he probably expected. "I didn't realize it at first," I said. "That makes sense," he replied quietly. "But even after you did?" he asked. I smiled slightly. "By then the pattern had been there for years," I said. Correcting it suddenly would have turned every conversation into a debate about who understood what. Daniel let out a soft breath. "I probably would have done that," he admitted. The honesty in that moment made both of us laugh quietly. For the first time in the conversation, the tension eased. Then Daniel said something that surprised me. "I think I thought I was simplifying things for you," he said. "Not limiting them." "I know," I replied gently. And I meant it. Because over the past few months, I had come to understand that Daniel's behavior had never been about superiority. It had been about assumptions. The quiet kind of people form when they believe they understand someone completely. Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking again. "I wish I had asked more questions," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "You're asking them now." He looked up at me again. "Yes," he said. But 10 years later, there was no bitterness in his voice, just a reflection. And the interesting thing about that moment was how calm it felt. No raised voices, no dramatic apologies. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally acknowledging something that had quietly shaped their relationship for a decade. The truth didn't break anything. But it did change how clearly we could see the past. And sometimes, clarity arrives long after the moment when it would have been most useful. If you had asked me 10 years earlier who I was inside my marriage, I probably would have answered very simply. I was the stable one, the organized one, the person who kept our life running smoothly while Daniel focused on the larger structures of his career. At the time, that identity felt natural, comfortable even. But looking back now, I realize something important. That role wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Because the version of myself I had been living inside for years was only one part of a much larger person. And strangely enough, it took a quiet misunderstanding to reveal the rest. After that conversation in the living room, Daniel didn't suddenly transform into a different person. Our lives didn't change overnight, and we didn't begin having intense intellectual debates every evening. That kind of dramatic shift rarely happens in real life. What changed instead was much smaller and much more meaningful. Curiosity. Daniel began asking more questions about the things I was reading or working on at the Arts Center. Sometimes the conversations lasted only a few minutes before moving on to other topics. But the difference was clear. He wasn't simplifying his explanations anymore, and I wasn't quietly staying within the role I had once accepted without thinking. For the first time in our marriage, our conversations moved in both directions. Not perfectly, just more honestly. At the Arts Center, my responsibilities had already expanded by then. The director eventually asked me to oversee long-term planning for several community programs, which meant working closely with funding structures that stretched years into the future. The work felt strangely familiar. Large systems, interconnected decisions, the same kinds of patterns Daniel had been navigating in his own world for years. Sometimes we even compared notes at the dinner table. Two people describing different systems that followed surprisingly similar rules. The irony of that still makes me smile. For so long, I had believed Daniel was the only one thinking in those larger patterns. In reality, I had been capable of it all along. I had simply been living inside a role that didn't require me to show it. And perhaps the most important realization of all was this. Daniel hadn't forced that role onto me. I had accepted it quietly, the same way many people accept the expectations that settle around them over time. No one had asked me to be smaller, but no one had asked me to be larger either. So I stayed where the space felt comfortable, until one quiet evening at a kitchen table, which made me see the limits of that space more clearly. Today, when I look at my life, I don't feel bitterness about those 10 years. They weren't wasted. They were simply a long chapter where certain parts of me remained unseen. Not hidden, just waiting. And sometimes that's how understanding arrives in relationships. Not through conflict, not through dramatic turning points, but through the slow realization that the person sitting across from you might be far more complex than you both once believed. When I think back to the beginning of this story now, I realize something that would have surprised the younger version of me. Nothing truly dramatic ever happened. There was no betrayal, no explosive argument, no moment where everything shattered and had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Instead, our story unfolded the way many real relationships do, through quiet assumptions that slowly shape the space between two people. For 10 years, Daniel believed he understood the boundaries of my world. And for 10 years, I quietly lived inside those boundaries without questioning them very much. Neither of us intended it that way. That's the part people often forget when they imagine misunderstandings inside a marriage. Most of them aren't created by cruelty. They're created by comfort. When two people grow used to certain roles, provider, organizer, planner, supporter, it becomes easy to assume those roles define the entire person. But people are rarely that simple. Sometimes the person sitting across the table from you is carrying entire parts of themselves that have never had a reason to appear yet. And sometimes it takes years before either of you notices. The interesting thing is that when the realization finally arrives, it doesn't always come with anger or regret. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a door opening in a room you thought you already understood. Looking back now, I don't resent Daniel for the assumptions he made, because in many ways, I shared responsibility for them. I never showed him those parts of myself. I never asked for the conversation to be deeper. I simply followed the path that felt easiest for both of us. Until one small moment made me see that I had more space than I realized. And once I stepped into that space, everything changed. Not dramatically, but honestly. So if there's one thing this story taught me, it's this. Sometimes the biggest shift in a relationship doesn't happen when someone else changes. It happens when you quietly allow yourself to be seen more fully than before. And now I'm curious about something. Have you ever discovered that someone close to you misunderstood a part of who you really are? Not because they meant to, but simply because that side of you had never appeared before? I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.